Welcome to episode 154 of Silver Lining for Learning. This episode is called EdTechBooks for this EdTech age. And we have three experts, two with us so far. We'll have three during the show. Rick West from Brigham Young University, who's a professor of instructional psychology and technology. Jason McDonald, who's a professor of instructional psychology and technology, and Royce Kimmons, also in the same department. They've been working really hard. And on this new website, EdTechBooks, so hard that they got an award at the AECT conference back in October in Las Vegas. And we want to give them a round of applause for that because they've made a difference in the world. Everyone tries to, get a new projects, initiatives, grants, and whatnot, but oftentimes the grant money runs out and then you move on to something else. This is something really substantive that's making a difference in the lives of students, faculty, universities, because we're talking about free and open textbooks, which is a hot button across the world. Everyone's trying to figure this out, how open education, open educational resources matter, and how to get people to, to accept and utilize and promote and contribute. And they've done all that. They've promoted this website, EdTechBooks. They've contributed to it. They've helped found the initial ideas for it. In fact, Royce has been the brains and the technology behind EdTechBooks. Maybe Rick or Jason can add a little bit to what I've discussed here so far, and maybe show the website. Also give a little bit about their backgrounds. Rick is actually coming from an airport, and so we may have a little background knowledge, but so far so good. Rick, why don't you take over and fill in the gaps, then we'll go to Jason, and maybe Royce will come in right after that.
Sure. And, I hope that Royce can join us because we have to give credit to Royce. This EdTechBooks website is really his genius idea and his baby, and his service to the, like you said, Kurt, to the profession, and what he's able to do is just, tremendous. And so this is the website right here. This is, I'm logged in. So these are some of the books that I've been working on, but you can go to the homepage and let's see if I were to log out here. You can see what it would look like for.
Before you go any further, wait a minute.
Yes.
Go back to that picture. You've been working on all those books? Contributing to them or getting promoting and arm twisting others, or what do you mean? I mean,
no, these are all my books that I'm a editor on or a co-editor on.
Wow.
So it gets kind of addicting once you get going with it because like you were saying, Kurt, it's a contribution to the field. I think we're all educators. We're educators because we want to share knowledge and information with others. So, and maybe that's the story here, and I'll give Royce this credit. But what happened was this original book right here. I was teaching a class called The Foundations of the Field, and there are great textbooks available for that course. But I was thinking to myself, it would be so great if we had an open textbook that was free for students, that was openly licensed so people could translate it or repurpose it or reuse it in different ways. And I was really interested in promoting open education, of course. And so I thought we need, we talk about open education, but we don't do it in our field. And there aren't very many open books in our field. At that time, I don't know that there were any like open textbooks. There were some open kind of scholarly books, but not textbooks. So I put together this book. I edited this book, The Foundations of Learning and Instructional Design Technology. And I did it originally in Pressbooks, and I apologize for the noise here. Like I said, I'm in the airport. But I did it originally with Pressbooks, which was, the best technology we had at the time. And it was okay, but it felt very limiting to me as a book creator. There were things that I just couldn't do with it. And it was cumbersome in many ways. It felt like it couldn't format in the ways I wanted my students to be able to read their book. And I was talking to Royce, which is right next door to me in our offices at BYU. And I said, wow, I'm just having so much trouble with Pressbooks. I wish we had something a little bit better that was a better experience for people that create these books. And he kind of sat there and was thoughtful and said, that's really interesting. And what would you want this service to be? And I kind of gave some ideas. And he came back, and I don't know if I'm embellishing the story, Jason, but it felt like a couple weeks, or I don't know, maybe it was a couple months, I don't know. But he came back shortly thereafter and said, hey, will you look at this? And he had this draft of EdTechBooks. And he's been developing it. It's only been out for a couple years, and he's been developing it rapidly. And like you said, it's won several awards. And I'll just give my endorsement of it. I think Royce has been brilliant at creating it. He wanted to create two things. One, he wanted to create a marketplace of sorts where you could find all of the open books in our field, because they were scattered all over the place. They were on people's websites and on over here at this university's website and over here, Scholars Repository. But one place where all the open textbooks in educational technology could be housed. That was the first goal. And so make it easy to browse and search and tag and look for these books. The second thing he wanted to do was to make a great service for creating these books, to make it possible for people to be able to create these books. And I think he's done a really great job on the editing side of this, the publishing side of this. And I'll actually say the third thing he's trying to do with this is help authors of open textbooks get credit for it. You know, in the academic system, sometimes if you publish open, you don't get quite the same credit. It's hard to explain the impact that open has to your promotion and tenure boards and things like that. So Royce is building in a lot of analytic data and a lot of kind of feedback data, so that when you go up for like promotion and tenure, you can make a strong case that your open material, even though it's not in a traditional publisher, is having as much or more impact. And we think that might be the biggest part of this whole thing, honestly, because if we can make it possible for people to get credit for this work, then I think a lot of people will jump in and do it.
So wait a minute. So can we go back to your website again? Because I want to point out that some of the people are only listening, and I want you to read a few of the titles so they're aware of some of the titles of these books that you turn. And I also have to mention that because this is now an audio, I have to introduce my co-host, Punya Mishra at Arizona State University, Young Zhao, who's at the University of Kansas and currently in Melbourne, Australia, and Chris Dede from Harvard. They'll be jumping in with questions with me. So if you want to read just a couple of titles, so people are, again, who are listening just the podcast and might be walking or running the trails, will come back and explore this a little bit.
Okay. So the website is edtechbooks.org, and tech is with the H on the end. So edtechbooks.org. And the first book is The Foundations of Learning and Instructional Design Technology. And that's the one that's kind of, I look at it as the first book that graduate students in our field would read. In fact, when students come to me and say, I'm thinking about your graduate program and I'm applying next year, what should I read to get ready for it? I say, read this book. This is the foundations of the field. It has a section on history, a section on technology, a section on design, a section on theory. And so that was the first book. And then this one, Design for Learning, Principles, Processes, and Praxis. That one I co-edited with Jason McDonald. He's the lead editor on that. And that's a book for an instructional design type of class. We have a book with Royce on rapid academic writing, and Royce has done most of that book, which is for a course on academic writing. So how to teach students to do academic writing. We've got a book on APA for novices. I have a book that I did with Jared Burrup. That's a practitioner book about how to teach with asynchronous video. So if you want to increase social presence and online learning. And then I'll explain what happens next. Is the Foundations book got too big. And some of the feedback that we got was, it's too big, it's too much for one student to read in a semester. And honestly, some students want to print it on demand because they like having a paper copy. And you can do that if the book is not too big. You can print on demand. The Design for Learning book, I think, Jason, you can get from Amazon for $10 or something like that. So we're doing a second edition of the Foundations book, but we're splitting it into two books. So there's Foundations second edition and Becoming an LIDT Professional. So how do you become an effective professional in the field? That's going to be kind of the two books that come out of the original Foundations book. There's this Failing Forward book is a collection of stories of people, and I hope all of you on this call will submit something to this, but it's a collection of stories from people in the field about their greatest failures.
Oh, Punya's got that.
Yeah. Well,
he's got many stories.
Honestly, I'm trying to decide which story to contribute myself because there's so many. But what happened is I was talking to students and they were like, and there was this one student and she had gotten to revise and resubmit to a journal, and she said, well, you and Dr. Leary never get revise and resubmits, you always get accepted at journals. And I went, are you kidding me? Failure is the nature of the field. And so I thought we need to make a book where people tell their stories of failure to normalize failure. So that's what that book is. And then maybe the last, go ahead.
No, Rick, just a quick comment. So Matt Kaler, my colleague at Michigan State, on his wall has all his rejects on his wall, so that when students come in, they can see all the papers that he got rejections for. Not even revise and resubmit, rejections.
Okay.
So that they can see that. Just wanted to share that quick thought. Yeah.
I'm going to email Matt and ask him, because that would be a fantastic story and maybe a picture to go in the book. That's great. The last one I'll say is maybe this Open Aims book. Some of these books are books I've been working on with students, but the Open Aims book is, I think, a cool new thing. So once again, I was talking with Royce. This is how this usually goes: is you get an idea, you talk to Royce, and Royce makes it happen. And so and he comes up with a lot of great ideas himself. But we were talking. We said it'd be great in open education. You've got open books. I do a lot with open badges. So you got open credentials. But one of the things that you need are assessments to understand if people have learned, whether they deserve a credential. But a lot of those assessments are behind paywalls, right? People create these measurement tools. They're published in some journal that you have to pay $30 to access the journal article, or maybe they even just lock it down for $200. You got to pay some publishing company to get access to the instrument. And we said, that's ridiculous. Let's make these instruments, these measurement tools, available to everyone. So this Open Aims book is assessments, instruments, and measurements. And it's a place for people to upload measurement tools, assessment tools, instrument protocols. And those would be, they're very short. They just have a little paragraph that explains what you would use this instrument for. You document all the reliability and validity tests on it, all the research that's been done with it. And then you publish it and it can start getting cited. So now you can get cited for your instrument in addition to any articles that may get cited. And then the instrument can be open so that people can translate it, use it, adapt it for their own research, give you credit, of course. But that's something that we're pretty excited to be starting. So
Rick, before Jason jumps in here, I just want to make two quick comments. In reading all your bios, I was impressed that you're teaching academic writing at BYU, and that rapid academic writing book I can actually use in my dissertation proposal class. I want to recommend it to people listening or watching later to check that one out. The second thing is, you mentioned Jared Burrup, who's now at George Mason University. I just emailed him yesterday. I think we need to have Jared on a show with the GoTech Center, the Global Teacher Ed Center. So you've given me an idea for a new show. I have a question, though. I have 2 open textbooks. How do I get those 2 open textbooks to be listed in here? How does anyone who's got an open textbook, who do they contact? What do they do? How would it qualify? Those kinds of things.
yeah, so you contact Royce Kimmons, which is Royce Kimmons at byu.edu, and not you can either create the book in EdTechBooks, or you can link to it. So some of these books that are showing up in various collections, for example, some of these books are actually published somewhere else, like Athabasca University, and then we're just linking to them. Once again, trying to make a marketplace of all the books. So your books, Kurt, that are already open and available, you can have Royce link to them here within the system. So
great. We should go to Jason before he falls asleep on us. Jason, you want to add to what Rick had to say? You want to talk about certain books that you've been involved in? I know you've got a couple of book chapters that have just come out. Jason, are you with us?
Good morning. Yeah, I am. Thank you. Great introduction there by Rick. Just maybe a couple of things that I would add. One is we call these books and book chapters, but they're rich media experiences. So Royce is, over time, he's added the ability to embed audio and video, media interactives inside of these chapters. And so, yes, of course, again, students can print a copy on demand that they can thumb through and read offline. But when they're online, they have all of these rich interactions along with the text, which I think is a great value add and a great service to the learning community. This book, Rick has it up on the screen. It's one that he and I edited together a couple of years ago, Designed for Learning: Principles, Processes, and Praxis. We don't want to there are so many wonderful introductory textbooks in our field, right? So us saying that we have now an open textbook is not meant to say there's not value in these other textbooks. But like all professors, we kind of wanted to have our take on it when we're teaching our own students this, right? And one of the things that we thought is that in so many of the textbooks that were available, it teaches our field, LIDT, more as fundamentally as a process. We wanted to teach it as a mindset. How do we approach educational problems in a different way? And so that was the genesis of this book. We also wanted it to be appropriate for undergraduates as well as graduate students, because we have a couple of undergraduate classes in the field at our university for a design thinking minor that we administer. So this particular book is divided into two parts. Of course, we have the practices, instructional design practices, but we also have a section called then instructional design knowledge that goes into sources of design knowledge, the different processes, of course. We also have sections, real practical sections on designing different types of learning media. So instructional text, instructional graphics, instructional videos and simulations. And these are chapters written primarily by practitioners in the field, the people who are spending day-to-day designing simulations. And they will, so that in the simulations chapter, for example, it gives us some insights into what makes for a good simulation, but then also some really practical tips of how do I pull something like this off myself if I'm a practitioner tasked with designing an instructional simulation.
Thanks, Jason. I know Punya's got a question or a comment. Punya, want to jump in?
Sure. So thank you guys for joining us this morning. I was on the Slack with Melissa Warr, whom you know, and I said, ask a difficult question. But I don't think she asked a difficult question. I think you guys would have the answer for that. But I was sort of curious, and I'll follow up with her question, is what's the data on how much this is being used outside of BYU? I'm just curious about that. And then I'll follow up with Melissa's and sort of a modified version of my question as well.
Rick, you're probably the best one to answer that. You're pulling up the analytics here, it looks like.
Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, so one of the cool things about this book, like I said, is that the idea is Royce is trying to give people data so that they can go to their promotion and tenure committees and say, yeah, this is EdTechBooks. I know it's not Springer. I know it's not Routledge, but let me document for you the impact that we're having so that you can get credit for it in your academic system. So this is some of the analytics on the Foundations book that I was talking about. The ratings, that most of the ratings are pretty high, so the chapters are well rated. You can rate each chapter as students read them, so you get feedback on which chapters are working well and which ones aren't. You can let's see some other things, monetary feedback. So far he's estimated. He basically takes an estimate of what a commercial book would cost if students were using that, and he looks at how many students have used the book based on access rates and download rates and things like that. And he estimates how much money you've saved students. So far, this Foundations book has saved students $3 million. And that's an interesting number to give a promotion and tenure committee and say, what's my impact? Forget impact factors, forget citation. I mean, you want citation counts too, but I've saved students millions of dollars with my textbook. That's a real world kind of impact that you can talk about. You can see the people that are using it the most. So this is Baker University is using it. Towson. I know that the Philippines we have a lot of people. We have the design book that I did with Jason has been translated into Farsi. We know somebody contacted us, said, we're translating your book into Farsi. And then you can see it by different chapters too. Like overall, we've had 400,000 page views, 200,000 downloads. Different, we have audio for these books too. So some people that are listening to the book rather than reading the book, the audio is automatically there for every single chapter. Text to speech from Amazon. So those are some of the impacts that we know we're having is around the world.
Perfect, thank you. So
let me just, if I could just add one thing
sure,
too.
Jason,
it is, and this isn't, of course, I mean, this isn't systematic data, but it is kind of remarkable when we go places around the world, people bring up, oh, you're the Design for Learning guy, or you're the EdTechBooks guys, right? So I'm planning to spend some time in Europe next summer, and as I'm planning that trip, the person I'm coordinating with just sent me an email and said, I was talking about your visit with some of my colleagues, and they brought up, oh, well, we use your Design for Learning textbook in some of our introductory courses here. And so we get these little pockets of people popping up here and there, letting us know that they're using our work and that it is having an impact. Again, this that Rick is showing on the screen is systematic data, but those little personal connections are kind of fun too, as you can imagine, as we hear about the impact from people around the world.
Absolutely. And I think the piece that you, Rick, sort of alluded to, but I want to sort of emphasize that this is particularly significant for people, for students and educators in the global South, for whom these textbooks that we have are prohibitively expensive. I mean, they are stupidly expensive here. But if you multiply that by 80 or whatever the conversion factor right now is for the Indian rupee, these are off the charts. So this is an amazing service. So no doubt about that at all. And I just wanted to underline that fact that this is global in its impact. It's not just within the US, right? But the question that I had, so the question that Melissa had is that how do you ensure quality in your textbooks? That how can I, as an instructor, know that I can trust the books? And I had a sort of quasi follow-up to that. Like, the field keeps changing rapidly. Do you have any processes for updating the stuff that's on there? Because, as you know, I was in March at BYU and was talking about like OpenAI and ChatGPT, and guess what? The world has like turned upside down, at least in that space. And I think it's going to have implications for instructional design and education. So given that we work in in the space of ed tech, where there is so much churn conceptually, technically, and so on, how do you sort of make sure that the books are staying up to date? So why should I trust you guys, and how do I know that you are up to date?
That's a great question.
Jason, which one do you want, Jason? Take one of those questions.
Let me take the quality question. And I'll take it from a couple of different angles. One is we want flexible processes for our authors or editors. And so, for example, for our Design for Learning book, we wanted this to be something that other instructional design professional educators would trust. And so we put all of our chapters through a peer review process, just like you would see with with a journal or with many scholarly books. And so we did an editorial review and a peer review on the chapters. That's one method I think that helps raise the quality of the submissions. Also, though, we want to expose to readers what the community thinks is valuable in this collection. And so you can see on the screen that this particular book as a whole has been rated 4 out of 5 stars. Individual chapters can be rated by readers, how useful it was when they get to the end of it. We get different analytics about how long people spend with each chapter. Do they read the whole thing or not? So different, again, that helps us as we can start to triangulate all of these different sources together about whether it's quality material or not. The last thing I would say to Melissa's question, it's an important question, and I recognize where it's coming from, but I also want to say that one of the values in having an open collection like this is that the community decides by use what's valuable and what's quality and what matters to them. And so we are okay if there are some things in the collection that that may have, maybe a little bit lower quality according to at least some standards. We think that the process of other people finding it and not being satisfied with it and ultimately replacing it over time will ultimately increase the quality of the whole collection.
Rick, anything to add?
I'll add a couple other things too. Is Royce has implemented these badges here, and on the homepage you can search for books based on these badges, based on books that are trending, books that are peer reviewed, books that are have had high enough rating by students, books that are by authors that are experienced in this area of open textbook publishing, have done this before. So there are different kinds of badges for different books, and then you can search for books that have these badges and they're tagged that way. So that's one way you can find quality as well. I'll speak to the idea of how to keep things current, because I believe that's really important, Punya. Thank you. When I first made the first Foundations book, a couple things I noticed. One is the print copies of books were outdated within 2 or 3 years. And I thought, well, that's not helpful. The second thing I noticed is when people did open textbooks, they would make a nice book. They usually did it with a group of team, that's a collaborating team, and then they'd stick it on a website somewhere, and then they'd forget about it, and it'd be like 10 or 12 years old. And I thought, this is ridiculous. So that's one thing that the publishing world does really well, is they force you to update your book every 4 or 5 years, right? They come to you and say, it's time for a second edition, you need to do it. So I've tried to take that as a commitment myself, that at least for the main textbooks, I want to update them every few years. And that's why we are in the process of updating the Foundations book to the second edition, was so that it doesn't get old and stale. And we're getting about probably 60% of the chapters are brand new. The other ones, we've invited the authors to update or refresh with new citations, with new multimedia, like Jason was talking about, new learning content, like learning checks and stuff like that. So the new edition will be coming out this year. But that's one thing we're trying to do, is just being conscious that it's not enough to make the book. You've got to then keep it updated, refresh it every few years.
So
This is a commitment by people. This is a commitment that we, we can't talk about this website without talking about the commitment. And so we hope that people who are interested in get invested, not just to put your material out there, but to keep it current and keep it fresh, because that's part of the whole learning enterprise, is making sure that we're giving our students the best material that we possibly can, the most up-to-date material we possibly can.
So I think Chris
Thank
has,
you.
yeah. Chris has a
Chris
question,
said that
and then we'll go back to Punya. And so if you want to
Chris,
stop, what's that?
Sorry, Chris suggested that I just drop in with Melissa's question. And
Okay.
Then Chris so just so that people who are listening know, Melissa Ward is a former student of Rick West and then a student of mine. So that's the connection. So she's the one who's dropping all these questions in here. So the other question that she had is that, is there a way that I can take chapters from multiple books and combine them into a textbook for my class? I think she's setting up a softball for you guys because she likes you guys, but I will let either of you take that.
So the cool thing about this website, that's actually not the question she asked, but kind of similar, is how do I do this? What do I have to do this? If you go to edtechbooks.org, you create an account with your ORCID ID or with your Google login. Once you create an account, you can start creating a book. All of you can go start creating a book right now. So somebody like a Melissa Ward or anybody else who's listening could go create their own book. And then these chapters are licensed. So if you look at this, it has a license down there. This is CC by non-commercial. So you can grab a chapter with a license that's appropriate and then copy that and then put it into your new book with attribution. And so, yeah, that was actually the original idea with the Foundations book, is I envisioned that I originally had a section of the book that was BYU, that was going to be like classic articles from BYU faculty so that students know what their research is about and stuff like that. Because my thought was, this shouldn't be a book for everybody. This should be a book for BYU. And then Indiana should take it and make their own version of it and have the version of the book with Indiana faculty highlighted or something like that. So that's totally possible. And I think something that could be a good idea.
So I think Chris is going to
Chris.
jump in here, but you might want to stop the sharing temporarily and jump back into the sharing as we get to it.
So I think that impact is an important concept here, because our academic mechanisms for rewarding impact are really broken. I once wasted the 3 minutes I had with Harvard's president, and I knew it wouldn't work, but I felt morally obligated to say, this business of having, 10 to 15 people who are best in the world write a letter for you to say you are also best in the world so that you're worthy of getting tenure at Harvard. Beyond other problems, it doesn't work for emerging areas. Because nobody knows who's best in the world right now in generative AI, for example. And so there's no way to set up those letters in a reasonable way. You set them up, but you set them up with people who don't understand generative AI, who say, well, let's get some people who know about intelligent tutoring systems to judge this work. So it guarantees tenuring and rewarding people in the rearview mirror, which is the opposite what we should be doing, especially in technology. And as you know, another big issue with impact is what journals you publish in. And you know, the faculty at elite institutions, including mine, are really proud of the fact that if they can publish something that's read by 6 other people, but it's in a prestigious journal, that's impact compared to, you know, the kinds of things that you're describing. And so everybody is saying, well, it's not quantity, it's quality. Where's your quality? Why aren't you in these top journals as defined by, you know, some elaborate formula? And that again is a poor way of judging quality, because it's again sort of saying that people who have a lot of history and who judge through a historic lens are going to be the ones to determine what's going on in the field. So we have so many more ways now in an era of big data of collecting information about impact. And certainly it isn't pure impact. You don't just want to say, well, my book on learning styles had 20 million reads, so obviously I'm the most influential person in the field of education. But there does need to be some balance between quality and impact, because otherwise you get the situation we have now where people know more and more about less and less. So how do we combat that? I'm finally getting to my question here. How do we combat that?
Yeah.
Because there needs to be some other mechanism by which these works are recognized, so that somebody can say, I'm going to publish my book with you, and I think that book will get this award and this other special recognition, and a review in this top journal that acknowledges the impact and the dissemination as an important part of it. That's not going to happen spontaneously, because people are going to stay invested in the system that rewarded them. So do you see any kind of proactive measures that those of us who believe in the work that you're doing could start to create, to at least have an alternative reward system that people can cite and try to argue for when they're going up?
You know, that's such a great question, and there's really only 3 simple things, and this is something that would be really easy to solve in the next 20 minutes, right? No, of course not. I mean, this is a big challenge that you brought up, Chris, and it's something that we've recognized as we've worked in the system. Both Rick and I think Royce recognized it as he was developing the system. I think part of the answer, part of at least my answer, is some of the things that we've already shown in terms of trying to capture multiple forms of impact, not just one, but trying to triangulate from multiple forms that could be shared with tenure promotion committees. I think another aspect of it, though, is that those of us who now are in the position of evaluating others, we have to take the step. It shouldn't be left to those assistant professors who are making their tenure case for why these other alternative measures are valuable. It needs to be us who are evaluating those assistant professors, saying we are going to help them make their case for them. We are going to advocate, as this packet goes up the chain, why this person and the evidence they've shown is as quality as if they were following traditional measures. And that means that some of us may have to stick our necks out a little bit. Some of us may need to use our reputational capital or institutional capital. And I think some of us are just going to have to try to do double work. Like, we're going to have to make the case, I was excellent and strong in the traditional measures, and I was excellent and strong in these other measures. And so doesn't that provide some evidence that these other measures are as valuable? You can see that me, by living both of these worlds, both of them should be valued and honored as scholarship, not just the one method that we've traditionally had. I hope that makes a little bit of sense there.
Royce or Brick, you want to add to what Jason had to say?
Well, I'll just jump in and add that, we have these systems in place that, are intended to help us to understand quality or impact, but we've come to rely upon proxies that aren't very effective, right? So like impact factor, for instance. Why do we have impact factor? Well, it's intended to lead us to impact, but why have we come to define the impact that a scholar has on the world based upon the number of citations that that scholar receives from other journals, right? Why do we think that's what impact means? And so I think in some ways too, in thinking about these, the affordances of big data, as Chris has pointed out, but just the opportunities we have to collect new kinds of data really should force us to reevaluate what quality even means and what impact even means, right? And so like, instead of saying that quality or impact means that my article is going to be cited by 10 other articles, why did I write the article to begin with? Well, I wrote it to impact society. I wrote it so that people would actually read it. And so are there more direct measures of indicating whether or not my article is being read or indicating whether or not my article is high quality? So like, for instance, one of the things that we built in from the very beginning to the system is every chapter, every article has a quality assurance survey at the end, where similar to like an Amazon 5-star rating, right? And so with that, what we can see, what the author can see, and also what we can see at an administrative level is how the community of readers are responding to this content, right? So like, I don't know, when was the last time you read a research article and you rated it at the end? And other than like when you were asked to do a formal peer review, right? But like, so from an author perspective, then I can look at all the content I've created and see, oh, well, this chapter is, being perceived as high quality from the people who are reading it. This one is not. And so what do I need to do to improve this? But it also means, I think that, we don't view quality anymore as just having gone through a process. Well, I went through peer review, this was published, therefore this is quality. Well, no, we determine quality by whether or not it's actually achieving the aims that we had in place, which is it's useful to people, it's being read by people, and so forth. So I think in many ways, like OER allows us to remove some of those traditional proxies that we've come to rely upon that are not good measures to begin with of quality or impact, and to really ask ourselves, what do we really care about? And again, this is a systemic question, and I think Jason and Chris have talked about, what we need to do to get our systems to move in those kinds of directions, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I think central to this whole process is, really challenging this conception of what do we mean by impact and quality, and continually being willing to do that. So rather than just trying to replicate an impact factor, which we can do that, but like, we have to ask ourselves, like, why would we want to do that? What is the goal of doing that to begin with? And the goal is to understand the impact that the work that we're doing is having on the community.
So Royce, Rick's got a couple pointed questions in the chat, and I'll let Rick go ahead and why don't you be a moderator here, Rick, and take over host privilege and ask Royce that question.
Well, and I was just typing out some things, but I think the question is, Royce, is introducing you a little bit, and getting from your perspective, what is the goal of EdTechBooks, and why did you develop it, and what are you hoping to accomplish with EdTechBooks, I think is the question. But I'll just introduce you while you're collecting thoughts. So Royce is a associate professor at BYU, and a fantastic scholar and researcher in his own right. I do a series of studies for the Educational Technology Yearbook that shows who are the most impactful scholars in the field. Royce is one of the top 50 most impactful scholars in the field over the last 5 years. So he's a top scholar, but also a wonderful developer, has great programming skills, and teaches with us at BYU, teaches OER, technology skills for pre-service teachers, design skills for graduate students, some of those types of courses. So maybe that's the question for you, Royce, is what were you hoping to accomplish with EdTechBooks, and has that changed? What are your current goals with it? Oh, and I'll ask one more question, a question that maybe no one else on the panel would ask, but they should. is what's in your mind for next, because Royce always has a next for the service.
That's on my list here.
Okay, good.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for that introduction and those questions, Rick. So I guess just to brief, I think that it has changed a little bit, or the vision has changed a little bit. So initially, I think EdTechBooks started off from a conversation I had with Rick about, we were both creating our books on different platforms and we had no way of connecting them together. We had some challenges with using those platforms and challenges like what data we had access to. And so we thought, I think Rick said, why can't we have just like a landing page that brings all of our content together? And so we started to do that, but then quickly realized, we could do this better than maybe what some of the other platforms are. So like initially, it was almost just a simple response to, both Rick and I and others were wanting to create OER, but as a simple response to limitations that we were seeing in tools. But I think it's kind of evolved since then to bring in some of these other questions of like, how do we challenge these traditional notions of like quality, for instance, with OER? So remember early on, I was showing a colleague at EdTechBooks and he was looking at it and he said, well, these don't look like open textbooks. And well, what does that mean, right? Well, it means that he had equated openness in his mind with low quality. And so, or low production value. And so I think, after that initial like alpha version, the challenge then became like, how do we make OER and open textbooks high quality and also have the same kind of production value that we come to expect with commercial publishers? And can we do that in a way that, removes as many barriers as possible from people who would be willing to publish? And I think over time, like the metaphor that I've come to really appreciate with this is the idea of the giving machine. So if you've ever seen these, there's a big red like vending machine looking boxes that show up typically around the holidays in like Salt Lake City or New York City, where it looks like a vending machine, but you go up to it, you don't actually get anything from it, but you purchase things for people on the other side of the world. So you purchase like a polio vaccine, you purchase a goat, you purchase a goat for a family, you purchase shoes. What does this machine do? Well, this machine doesn't create generosity. It's not like I'm walking on my way to lunch and all of a sudden I see this big red machine and I become a generous person. It doesn't mean that it doesn't increase my ability to give either. All it does is it connects. It removes the barriers to giving, right? So if I am someone who has the resources and the means and the willingness to help someone else on the other side of the world, is there a system that can jump in and help to connect my generous impulses and my resources to meeting the needs of someone across the other side of the world? And so like what the machine does then is it doesn't create generosity. It doesn't create, these generous impulses. It doesn't increase resources, but what it does do is it removes barriers to giving. And so I think that, that's kind of become my mantra in many ways, and thinking about, what should a site like EdTechBooks do? Well, it should become a vehicle that removes the barriers to people creating and sharing their knowledge and resources with one another. Because I think, especially in education, so many of us come into the field wanting to help and benefit and bless others. But then, we have to deal with things like tenure. We have to deal with things like technical expertise that prevent us from actually acting on our generous impulses. And I just feel like there's so much social capital and so many resources that we have available to us that are not being used to benefit other people. And it's not because we're not generous. It's not because we're not skilled or don't have anything to provide. It's that we lack systems that allow us to connect that with the needs of people around us. And so if we can have systems that kind of remove those barriers, then that's ideal. So that's kind of shaped how I've gone about, the development in the past few years of EdTechBooks, trying to make it as streamlined as possible to remove those barriers.
Thanks, Roy.
And so I guess that's kind of become my realization, I think. And one of the things that has surprised me most is I think when I was starting this, you would see a lot like in the OER literature, things like people proposing that we need to be giving more, we need to do more, we need to, change our mindsets. But I guess I've come to realize that like Yeah, so sure, there's some of that, but ultimately we behave in the ways that we do because of the systems that we operate in, right? Because I have to get tenure, because I have to, publish this, because that's the only way through a commercial publisher, because that's the only way that a tenure committee will view it as valuable. And so I think that the goal then of the system has come to be, how do we challenge that, and how do we allow people to act on their generous impulses, have the effect that they want to have in the world, while at the same time like legitimizing that, making that something that is not only easy to do, but also something that can be recognized either like through analytics or whatever else.
So I'll jump in here, Royce, and just say that we'll get to the future maybe later in the future of the show. We got about 10 minutes left, or 15, about 15 minutes. So we have a few questions. Also point out, when I was asked to rewrite my World is Open book or add to it for a paperback, I wrote a prequel. It's titled Giving and Sharing. And so I talked about the sharing culture, and I created 8 share sites: publication share, survey share, book, library share, all these training share, all these share sites. I was playing around with things. I was dabbling in all this 20 years ago and how people could give and share. So I really appreciated your comments there. But I want to take this in a little different direction. Well, actually, I was going to do these 2 questions. I'll reverse the order, so I'll connect with what you had to say. The field and higher education in general is replete with people discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Could you talk about, could any of you guys, Jason, Rick, or Royce, talk about, aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or if people are interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion within the learning design technology field? Which books might they pick up on, or chapters within certain books might they look for, or who might they contact to hear how they're addressing it, that you've seen them utilizing those at Open EdTechBooks in a novel or interesting or creative way? Anyone?
I'd like to hear Royce's answer to this first, because I think this is something that he's actually quite passionate about.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there's there are a lot of tools. There's lots of content on EdTechBooks related to this. For instance, Susan Kozioglu and George Velichanos recently published a book on digital feminist pedagogy. We also have, so like one of the things with how I've engineered EdTechBooks is that we can have like multiple like sister sites where we share content between the sites. Yeah, thank you. So this is equitypress.org. So this runs on EdTechBooks software. But what I was finding is that we had quite a few people who are passionate about equity, who wanted to create resources, but they didn't fit under kind of the EdTech umbrella. So you see books here, for instance, like Foundations for Education for Emergent Bilinguals. And so Equity Press was a way of like allowing them to use the software, but at the same time, not forcing them into kind of the EdTech box. So there are a variety of resources here that I would encourage folks to go check out. But then I know that also in Rick's and Jason's books, there are specific chapters that address these topics very well as well.
Rick or Jason?
Yeah, so just one example of that. So Rick, if you go into the understanding section of the instructional design practice, our chapter 2 in our book is designing for diverse learners. We thought it was important, given exactly the kind of things that you were bringing up, Kurt, to start our book with a strong statement that learning is not just for the people that learning has traditionally been for. And a new LIDT professional should focus as much on those with diverse needs as they would on people exactly like themselves. And so in addition to the tools that Royce is building in, I think a lot of the authors have the same kind of appetite. I think people who are invested in OERs often are also invested in issues of equity in learning. And so a lot of these books, I think you'll see that there are attempts, at least, our best attempts to promote it and allow for it and encourage it. And maybe most important of all, to teach our students how to be those kind of advocates and those learning designers themselves.
And I'll add too, I think one of the challenges that we've been trying to grapple with OER more recently is not just, to address these topics, but to ensure that everyone has a voice, right? Because one of the the issues with the economies of open is that those with power are the ones that typically have the freedom to be able to participate. So we don't just want affluent white males in the US creating resources on diversity and then forcing other, that's what's out there, right? After that point, that's the content that we have access to. So Rick, could you share EdTechnica, the encyclopedia? But so like one example of this is I with Aras Bozkurt and Mahabali and Melissa War and Jill Stefaniak and Camille Dixon-Dean are starting an open encyclopedia of educational technology. You can come in and read about, and there's an open call here, but you can come in and read about what our requirements are. But for this, we are really encouraging, and actually we didn't do an open call at first because we were intentionally inviting women in the field and people outside the United States in particular to submit before we open it up to anyone else, because we wanted to ensure that not just are we dealing with topics that are important for equity and inclusion and diversity, but that we are empowering authors to do this as well. And so like, if you go ahead and look at, I believe if you click on about this, the encyclopedia there at the top, Rick, like one of the things that we're trying to do with this is be very transparent about who's publishing in it. So if you scroll down to author demographics at the very bottom, so we're trying to keep this up to date as we move forward, because the reality is, if you have the opportunity, for instance, to publish in an open journal or an open encyclopedia, you're going to attract the primary applicants that you're going to get are white males. And so we have lots of white males that are publishing in this encyclopedia, but we've also intentionally worked very hard to try to make this more diverse in authorship as well. And so I think that is a something that we have to intentionally do both, and that's a design decision, how we build systems to ensure that there aren't any barriers, but also we have to build cultures around nurturing. And I think Mahabali was the one that brought this up, and thinking about, for this particular project, how do we approach editing? Do we approach editing as our role as editors as gatekeepers, or do we approach it as nurturers? And I think that that has really shaped how this particular project, how we go about thinking about our role as editors, is that we want to nurture authors in creating high quality content rather than just serving as gatekeepers.
So Royce, I saw Mark Brown on the list there of contributors. He was on the show last week, and Mahabali was on a year or two ago from American University of Cairo. A lot of familiar names there, and I recommend people check all the whole site out. I have a follow-up question for you guys, and then we'll go to Punya to close here. Punya has a couple of things. Maybe Punya can also ask about the future question. So undergrad educational technology is something that's really vibrant in East Asia and Southeast Asia. People major in it. In America, not so much. But recently that's starting to change. And so I'm wondering about how this EdTechBooks site can expand the field, not only address the undergraduate needs, and as people design undergraduate programs like West Florida, and I think Mississippi State and some others have undergraduate programs. I think actually David Merrill talked about this before, one of his last talks I saw, was he said, the field's going to expand at the undergraduate level. So, how, and because it's free, all these books are free, that makes a lot of sense. Parents want to save money and so forth. Can you talk about, any of these books that are purposely designed for an undergraduate audience, and also to get to the general public out there as the field's exploding with jobs? How are people, who are in their high school years finding out about the field and deciding this could be a viable major for them, either as an undergraduate or as a graduate student? So what's your vision in terms of expanding the possible audience or addressing an audience that exists that hasn't been addressed before?
There was a very intentional thought in Rick and our minds when we did the Design for Learning book to make this useful for an undergraduate audience, just to address the first point that you brought up, Kurt. Because we see the same kinds of trends, and we, I think, recognize as well that the future of this field has to include a large component of undergraduate education in some fashion. For a traditional publisher right now, maybe the economics of that doesn't make sense, right? Undergraduates have different needs than graduate students, but if you only have 2 programs in the nation that are teaching undergraduates, or 5, or a very small number, it may not make sense economically for a traditional publisher to target that market. But we can create open books very easily for those markets and give them the same access. Part of the vision of our university, and I think Royce is kind of promoting this just with the EdTechBooks as well, is the Z degree, zero cost degrees, where students don't have to pay additional money for materials. And for all of the reasons that we know about in higher ed, where the costs are just spiraling out of control, having free and open textbooks is a significant benefit and blessing to all students, but I think particularly to undergraduate students, and particularly to some of those underserved populations, like first generation undergraduate students who don't have a tradition of college in their lives. Royce is going to have some other things he'll say about that in a second. Let me just add one other comment. You say for the general public, yes, BYU, we the communities we serve see a need around the world for people to be educationally minded. Whether they do this in their day-to-day jobs or not is not the question. The question is, are they in places where they have to make educational decisions? And would they be better served by having at least some way of approaching those decisions and seeing things in the situations they wouldn't see otherwise, just with their own backgrounds, their own training, or whatever their own disciplinary backgrounds are? And so we see this as well as just a great opportunity to share the vision of what education could be with publics that have an interest in it and are invested in it and are going to be doing it, whether they have the job titles or not. And if we can just help them do it a little bit better, I think we feel like we've been successful.
So both Royce and Rick, if we could have just a 30-second answer on each, because I want to go to Punya's question. We only have like 3 minutes left. So
yeah, so Melissa mentioned Tori Trust's book. She's done some great things for EdTech undergrad folks. She has at least 2 or 3 books that are super helpful. With Anna Bright-Leftwich, I've written the K-12 Educational Technology Handbook. That one's widely used. And I don't know if you talked about usage at all, but I'll just mention that most of our users now on EdTechBooks are outside the United States. And so that's predominantly undergraduate learners, the age group that's using the site.
Rick, you have any final comments before we go to Punya?
I'll just say that I know that as well, we are getting a lot from the professional world as well. There are Facebook groups and online groups of instructional design professionals, and they'll raise questions and concerns about, like, how do I do this? Anyone have a resource to help me with this kind of instructional design challenge that I'm facing? And a lot of times these EdTechBooks get referenced as, and they're grateful for those open sources because they don't have access to institutional libraries. They, that pay the fees so they can access a chapter in Springer or a book in Routledge. So for them, these open books are maybe the only way that they can stay current in the field, or the best way, other than just Medium articles.
Sorry, one other that came to mind that I should have mentioned at the beginning is Charles Graham's K-12 blended teaching books, and he's now creating an entire series, but also Brian Beatty's HighFlex book as well. With both of those books, those were published shortly before the pandemic, and we found that all of a sudden we had districts all over the US and across the world trying to figure out how to do hybrid and online learning. Like, having access to these free resources was a huge benefit to them. And so like in terms of undergraduate education, but also on professional learning, these resources are widely used. And one of the things that they allow us to do is to connect that so that, when we train teachers in our university to go out and teach, they no longer, once they're in the classroom, they're using the same resources that they were using as undergraduates. So it allows us to connect professional development efforts with our undergraduate efforts as well, which is super exciting.
So Punya, it looks like we've run out of time, but you want to jump in here with your comments and questions?
Yeah, quick comment. So this is a complaint, actually. I think you guys sold yourself short by calling it EdTechBooks. I think, so Royce, every time I go to the site, I see books over there which are not directly connected with EdTech, and that is awesome and amazing. So one suggestion is think of a different URL, because I think you are going to be attracting such a wide audience of people to the site. And I think in some ways, by calling it EdTechBooks, you are selling yourself short. just given the kinds of resources. So maybe, Royce, 30 seconds to talk about what you think the future plans are before we introduce the next episode. So that's just as a suggestion. It's not really a complaint, but it sounds cuter when I say
No, it's perfect. And we've tried a few different domains. That's what stuck here at the beginning. As I mentioned before, I've designed it so that it can have multiple domains. And so we have Equity Press. We can do institutional domains, like BYU has its own, BYU Idaho has its own. So yeah, open.byu.edu. So we can easily roll this out into new domains and share resources between them. So if you have ideas, please share them. In terms of the future, some of the recent things that we added are things like digital object identifier, DOI registration. We can do that now. We can also do, we use AI to do automated text to speech. And I'm finding that, like in my classes, that students really benefit or value being able to listen to, we're on a podcast right now. Students want to be able to listen to the content in addition to read it. So we can create audiobooks that are very high quality very quickly for all the content. EPUBs are coming down the line at some point. We already have Microsoft Word conversion and PDF conversion, but we'd like to add EPUBs. One of the challenges that we faced is figuring out how to provide offline access to folks. So we have projects going in Ghana, for instance, and elsewhere in the world where internet access is not a given. And so EPUBs or other kinds of offline solutions, like on a Rachel server, for instance, where we can support local communities in creating content and syncing that back up with the mothership. Those are all things that we're thinking deeply about and how to support that. So those are some of the big ones, but then also just quality of life things. So I'm constantly making updates based on, someone sends me an email, like I can't figure out how to do this. And so we update the system to do that typically within a day or two. And so it's just usability is a constant emphasis that's guiding everything that we're doing.
Thanks, Royce. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Rick, coming from the airport out there in Utah. I appreciate all you guys coming in and actually be jumping in because we had an opening this week. And so this has been fantastic. I mean, we had enough stuff here for 2-3 hours. So, this has been really a great show. I'm hopeful that lots of people will listen to and get inspired by this podcast show, episode 154, EdTechBooks for the EdTech Age, also known as The Boys from BYU. Next week, we have a host reflection at 10 a.m. Eastern Time